All right, here we go, After Effects. This is part 2 of a 2-part series. In the first part, we created all of our assets that we would need in Illustrator. And in this part, we're going to animate them in After Effects. Now, when you first open After Effects, it probably has a thing to ask you to create a new project. And when you create a new project, you're going to get this screen right here. It really doesn't change anything. I can do it right now if we go to File, New Project. It's just going to give us this kind of blank project. And the project really is just a bucket to organize and control all of your assets, footage, and things that you've created, like in Illustrator, for instance. We're going to go ahead and create a new composition, and compositions are really where the action happens. And you can create compositions here, you can nest compositions within other compositions, and that's really kind of where all of the animating and work happens in After Effects. I'm not going to be using this composition because we'll create a new one, but just to kind of go over some of the settings here, I'm going to be using the HD TV 1080 preset. Normally, I would recommend that you work at 4K. Unfortunately, my GPU is not yet supported by After Effects. Hopefully, it will be in the future, but as of right now, it's not. And setting it at 4K on just my little laptop here probably isn't going to work very well. So we wanted it to render nice and quickly and get through everything efficiently. If you're working on a laptop, or you're working on especially a laptop that doesn't have a dedicated GPU or graphics card in it, you're probably going to want to stick with HD because 4K is just going to be a little bit too much for it to handle. Now, I am going to change the time here. Right now it's set at 15, and usually the default is 30. I think my animation is probably going to be about 6 to 10-ish seconds or so. I want to have a little extra though, so I'm going to set this to about 12. It's always easier to kind of cut off the end than it is to, have to extend all of your layers out and add time later. But you also don't want to have this giant kind of length of time that you have to scroll through to get anything done. So we'll go ahead and set it to 12. I'll just leave the background colors black and click OK. And now we see that we've got this comp over here in our project, and we've got the comp now opened on the timeline. And the timeline is going to be where we affect our layers and do all of our editing and masking and moving things around. So let's go ahead and import our Illustrator file. So we're going to go to File, Import, File, select that Illustrator file, the rocket.ai. Down here at the bottom, we've got some settings we need to look at. First is it's going to import as footage. We don't want to do that because it's not footage, it's an Illustrator file, and we want the layers to be separate. So we're going to set this as composition retain layer sizes. So it's going to create a composition, and it's going to put all of the Illustrator layers on that composition. And we want it to retain layer sizes because we want the centers of the objects that we had in Illustrator to also be the centers of the objects that we get in here. Otherwise, it's just there's going to be kind of a disconnect because it's going to make all of the layers the size of the composition with the rotation center at the center of the screen, if that makes any sense. Anyway, you want composition to retain layer sizes. Don't check this box for Illustrator PDF EPS sequence. I know it seems like we should, but we don't want to because it's going to import this whole thing as just one big static image. And then finally, we do want to make sure that Create Composition is turned on. So if that's not turned on, make sure that's turned on. And then we can click Import. We get a couple of things. We get this folder full of Illustrator files. You can ignore this actually because we're not going to be using those directly. If you drag these down onto the timeline, you're going to get this jumbled mess. Like none of the positioning is what we had set up, so I'm just going to hit Control-Z and get rid of that. What you want instead is to open the new composition we created. Created this rocket composition named for the Illustrator file that we imported. And you should have something like this where they're all positioned in the same way that they were positioned in Illustrator. If we zoom out, we can see what that looks like. All right. So we're going to start animating this, and as with everything in After Effects, I strongly recommend animating as much as you can with scripts, because if you animate everything with keyframes, you kind of get to what's called a keyframe soup. It's just like this noodly, massive keyframes, and if you change one thing and there's, the timing of something else was dependent on that, then you have to go change the other thing, and then maybe there are other dependencies. So just kind of any little change that you want to make later on starts to kind of cascade and cause all these problems. You can avoid that by using scripts, because scripts and by linking layers to other layers and passing values from one layer to the next. Because if you update one, then those changes will automatically propagate kind of through all the layers like a network. Now I'm going to just start by rotating the border. If we expand this out, we can see all of our different properties. So if we open this up right now, we have transform and the universal properties that every layer has. We've got an anchor point, position, scale, rotation, and opacity. And you can see really quickly that this is going to start to become a problem because we have, just this one thing, and now we're almost out of room for our layers here. A way around that is to use keyboard shortcuts. So P for position, T for transparency or opacity, as it's labeled here. R for rotation, A for anchor point, and S for scale. So you can get to all those properties with just keyboard shortcuts. I'm going to hit R for rotation. And instead of keyframing this, where you would tell it to record a keyframe and then can bring your slider down here somewhere in the future and then change that value in some way, and it creates all the intermediate frames. I want to script this. Again, if I script it, it'll just kind of do its thing forever, and I don't need to worry about changing speed with keyframes and all that, and I don't need to worry about it just stopping randomly either. So this is going to be a little bit simpler. I'm going to hold Alt and click on the same stopwatch, but by holding Alt instead of starting keyframes, it's going to go away, Google Drive or OneDrive. By doing this, it's going to go ahead and give us a little script window here. I'm just going to delete the transform.rotation. And I know scripting sounds complicated, but After Effects makes it pretty easy. The first script here is just going to be time times, or use asterisk for multiplication, time times, and I'm going to do 50 just as a starting point. So time times 50. And now if we play this by pressing spacebar, we can see it's just rotating, and it'll just continue rotating like that forever. Essentially what it's doing is it's looking at whatever the time on the slider is, it's doing some math, and then it's applying that as a rotation value. Now if we wanted to change the speed, we can just change this number. So if I wanted to double it, I could do time times 100 instead. Click out of this, and then it'll apply that once you click out, and now it's going to rotate twice as fast. Another thing, if I wanted to rotate backwards, rotate the other way, I would just use negative numbers instead. So time times negative 100, and now it's going to rotate counterclockwise instead. I'm going to keep this at time times positive 50. And just go ahead and click back out of that. So we've got that rotating, and it's going to rotate forever. So there, we've done our first bit of animation, and we are done with that. The next thing we want to do is get the stripes to kind of move and appear as if they're just moving down forever, but obviously if we just move them down, we're eventually going to run out of stripes. I've seen people try to do just make this endless wall of stripes, but it's much easier to loop it. So with the stripes, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a duplicate of the back here. I'm just going to hit Control D, and we're going to take this duplicate of the background and the stripes, and we're going to pre-compose them. I can't loop an Illustrator layer like this. I can keyframe it, and I can move it, and I can rotate it, but I can't loop that animation. These need to be in a composition first, and so this is kind of the core functionality of After Effects is nesting compositions within other compositions. So I'm going to take these two, right-click them, pre-compose, give this a name, we'll call it stripes loop. And yes, we do want to move all attributes to the new composition, and yes, I also want to open that new composition. So I'll just click OK, and it's now going to open our new composition. You can see we've got now a bunch of tabs here where I can switch between the rocket composition that came in with the Illustrator file, comp1 that I initially created, which I'm not going to use that, so we're just going to go ahead and close that. And then we also have our stripes loop that we just created. Now, the way this is going to work is I'm going to be changing the position of the stripes. I'm going to open up stripes here and just hit P so I can see my position values. And essentially what I'm going to do is just move these down a little bit. The key though is with anything that's looping, your first frame and your last frame need to be identical. They need to look the same. So what we're going to be doing is moving this top line down until it's in the same position as this line is currently. With our numbers here, we have an X value and a Y value. X is going to be horizontal, Y is going to be vertical. And in After Effects, that's always in reference to the top left corner of the screen, or the top left corner of the composition. So this is 0, and if we increase the number, it's going to move down. If we increase the X, it's going to move to the right. So right now, these two numbers are essentially talking about this anchor point right here, the position of this anchor point in relationship to the top left corner of the screen. So it's 960 pixels to the right and 523.5 pixels down. I'm going to zoom in here, and what we're essentially going to do is just kind of drag this. We're going to have to eyeball it a little bit, but we're just going to drag this down until it looks like it's in about the right position. Oh, I need to keyframe it though. It didn't record my keyframe, so let's Control Z to undo. There we go. This wasn't doing it for me. There we go. Okay. So make sure that we record keyframes first. So with position, I'm going to go ahead and click my stopwatch. So it records a first keyframe, and this entire thing is only going to take place over the course of about 10 frames, not even a third of a second really. So we're going to zoom way in using these little handles until we see that 10th frame mark right there, and then at that 10th frame, I'm going to change this Y value, and we're just going to drag this down. I know in most programs you would kind of like grab stuff here in the editor and move it around. In After Effects, that starts to be kind of a problem because you'll have like bounding boxes obscuring your ability to click on things, and it just kind of gets difficult. So essentially what it's done is it's stored this position of 523.5 at the beginning in this first keyframe, and then this position of 548.5 in the last keyframe. And then it's just all the frames in between those is created in between frames for us. What we want to do is just kind of jump from the first one to the second one and see if it looks like that frame is the same. And it looks pretty close. It looks like this is actually maybe just a little bit high. I'm sorry, a little bit low. So we can take that and we can just tweak these numbers a little bit. I think probably 548 point, is it like a tiny amount, like 2.5 might be a little bit better. So we'll do, so it's going to round to 3 for us. So let's see if now jumping, that looks a little bit better. So it looks like it's in exactly the same spot. All right, and I'm going to zoom out. So to zoom back out, click this little drop down and click Fit, and that'll fit to screen. And I also want to see what it looks like while it's looping, and for that I'm going to zoom out of the timeline and grab this little handle right here. So this is our work area end handle. We have a beginning and an end, and zoom back in. And if we put the work area right here, I'll just put it on frame 10, we can play it and it'll just keep looping that animation forever. It'll keep replaying the same thing, and it actually is pretty close. I think that we're almost there. Let's go ahead and press play again. And it, if we cut out the top and the bottom, it looks like this is just this endless waterfall of wavy lines, which is exactly what we want. Now, to avoid an issue later on when we open this back up in our rocket, or kind of our top composition, we want to extend this work area out a bit. We're going to extend it out by 1 frame, so that this keyframe is on the 10th frame, and then the work area is on the 11th frame. Essentially each frame, like this whole thing is frame 0, this whole thing is frame 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And this whole thing right here is frame 10. And if we crop it out right here, what's going to happen is it's going to add this extra frame, but it's going to assume that that was blank, that there was nothing there. So we want to leave that little handle. We're going to put it on frame 11, so it should hopefully keep this here and avoid this like flashing effect. I'll show you how to fix the flashing effect in case we get it, but hopefully we don't have that. Now for this, I'm just going to go ahead and delete the back. We'll delete back 2, and we're going to go into rocket composition. And now if I zoom, I forgot to trim this composition. So first we need to set our work area. Now that we have the work area, I'm going to go to Layer, and I'm going to, Composition, and then we're going to Trim Comp to Work Area. And now this entire composition is only these 10 frames. Now I'm going to set this slider here on 10. Let's go back to the rocket composition. We can see that now this thing is much shorter. It's only 10 frames long, and then after that it disappears. So what we're going to do is we're going to set it to loop using an effect called Enable Time Remapping. So I'm going to go to Layer with that selected, and I'm going to go to Time, and I'm going to Enable Time Remapping. What this does is it basically creates points here, and creates anchor keyframes at the beginning and the end of our layer. And we can see here it's created that last keyframe there at the very end. And in that keyframe, everything's disappeared because we don't have 11 frames worth of animation. We only have it at 10. So in order to fix that, if I loop this right now, what's going to happen is it's going to flash. I guess I can go ahead and show you. I'm going to hold Alt and click on this, and here we're going to just use this little arrow to open up our library of scripts. After Effects has a bunch of these just already in here, like, you know, everything that we would worry about having to type in, it's already got in here. We don't actually have to type anything in or memorize anything because Illustrator has it here for us. After Effects has it for us. I'm going to select Loop Out Cycle from the Properties menu, or Loop Out rather, not Loop Out Cycle. And I'm going to delete all this stuff inside these parentheses. We need to keep the parentheses, but we don't need to keep the stuff inside there. As long as it says loop out, we're good. So what it'll do is basically just play all of the action between these two keyframes forever. But you see how it's like flashing. It's not what we wanted. So when it flashes like that, that's essentially just playing that empty keyframe at the end. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set my slider at, or playhead at frame 10. We're going to create a new keyframe at frame 10, and then I'm just going to delete this old empty blank keyframe. So now when we loop it, it'll play without that flashing. In order to hide the fact that it's kind of like, it's like playing and then jumping, it looks like it's kind of jumping back up to the top like that, we're just going to trim it, or we're going to mask it with our background. So with the background selected, I'm going to hit Control D to duplicate it. Give it a name. I'm going to call this the stripes matte. Notice I'm naming everything. Always name stuff. When you start to get into scripting, if you don't have names for things, it becomes this huge, monstrous problem. Always name stuff. It takes like a couple of seconds, and it will save you hours later on down the road. Put stripes loop above stripes, or stripes matte above stripes loop. And we're going to use what's called track matte. This is kind of similar to like a clipping mask in Illustrator, or clipping in Photoshop. What you do though is you'll put your clipping layer above the layer that you want to reveal with it, and then use this track matte option here. If you don't see the track matte option, there's this little button down at the bottom called Toggle Switches and Modes. If you see something like this where you have all these little checkboxes, just come down here and click Toggle Switches and Modes, and that will open up so we can see track matte here. Right now it says none, so I'm going to click the drop down for that. We're going to set this to alpha matte, to the stripes matte, which is just a copy of our background. So now it's only going to show those stripes just on the background. And now, when it's looping, it just looks, or it has the appearance as if it's just kind of this endless waterfall. Now, just a quick note on track matte, there are a few different options here. We've got alpha inverted. So alpha inverted, basically anything that's transparent is going to use as the mask and reveal it only on the areas that were transparent in the image above. Alpha matte normally just reveals it on pixels that are opaque in the image above. Luma matte is kind of similar, except it's based on black and white, so white is going to be opaque and black transparent, and Luma matte inverted is black is opaque and white is transparent. So we'll just leave this on alpha matte, and that's the effect that we want. So there we are, done with the rotation and the little waterfall, and so far we've only used 2 keyframes. So next we want to look at getting this rocket to move around. So how do we get the rocket to move around? I could keyframe it, and that would certainly work, but like I said, scripts are always going to be a little bit more flexible. So if you can script it, I'd recommend doing so, because you can always go in and change a number without changing, or without that affecting other things in the composition. In this case, I have a script already written, and another advantage of scripts is that you can basically write it, stick it in a text document like this, and then just paste it whenever you want to do that same movement again. So maybe if I wanted to do this in another animation at some other later date, I'd have this in a file, just copy, paste, and then change some parameters, and I'm done. I don't need to re-keyframe that whole thing again. So I'm going to hit Control-C to copy this whole script. And this is going to go onto the position properties. I'm going to hit P here and hold Alt and click that stopwatch and just paste it, Control-V to paste that in there. Now we'll kind of go through line by line and talk about what this is doing. The first line is establishing a variable. So it's saying that t equals 20. Okay, this is our variable declaration, t equals 20. We can change that later if we want to. We can tell t to equal something else, but as of right now it equals 20. Next line is saying that f equals thisComp.frameDuration times t. So basically what we're saying here in the first two lines, we're establishing a value that's going to control how fast this ship jumps around. So the frame duration times t, and then here in posterizeTime, it's basically looking at this number that we've got is for f, which is our number in t times the frame duration. So it's doing 1 divided by f. And so if we change this number to a lower number, we can make it jump around faster. A higher number, we can make it jump around slower. And then after the posterizeTime, basically every however many frames this computes out to be, it's going to apply the rest of this, which is setting two more variables, x for the x-axis. You could name this whatever you want, but I just named it x because it makes sense to me. And y, and then it applies those. So down here in the first property, or this, it's going to set this number as x, and then comma is going to set this number as y. Now we have a little bit more that we need to do here. I've just left a number sign in because it's going to be different for every document. But I need to type in these two numbers that we've got over here. The first number for x, or its position in the x-axis, is 962.0, so I'm just going to type in 962, not bother with the decimal. And here in the next one is 375.5, so 375.5. And that's our starting position for the rocket. And then, so at every however many frames, to say it's 20 frames, we're going to apply these two numbers down here. We're also doing a little bit of math to these. So we're taking 962 in the x-axis, and then we're adding or subtracting something from it. So it's going to be random every single time. So we're doing a function called random, where it's going to generate a number, and then I've got some limitations on that. It can't be like quadrillion. It's going to be something between -30 and +30. So -30 would be moving to the left, and positive would be moving to the right. So it's either going to move it left or right by a certain amount within a range of about 60 pixels. Same thing vertically. It's going to have -30 and +30 for a vertical movement. And then it's just going to apply those with x and y. And I'm just going to click out of this. And now if we play it, this thing is just going to jump around randomly. Sometimes bigger jumps, sometimes smaller jumps. And that's it. Basically, we're done. So now, with our script completed, we've done all this animation. We've only used 2 keyframes. Next, we want to get our particles set up. However, we want our particle emitter to follow along with the ship. And in order to do that, we need to set something for it to follow. Now, we can do the scripting directly on the particle emitter, but I like to have this kind of more visual and have a little bit more control over it. So I'm going to go ahead and make a null object. I'm going to make a layer, new, null. And a null object is just something, it has position, rotation, and scale properties and its own anchor point, but it doesn't show up in the scene. These are really handy for rigging characters and stuff like that. And you can apply a bunch of effects and stuff like slider controls to it, which I'm actually going to go ahead and add a slider control to this. If you don't see, I've already got it typed in here, but in your effects and presets dropdown, oops, we didn't want that there. Double click on it again to hide it, but if you don't see that, you'll find it on the window menu or effects and presets. I'm going to type in slider, and then we'll just add that slider control like I just did over here. So slider control, it's always, again, good to name things. So I'm going to name this vertical position. All right, and on the null object, we'll call this the particle emitter anchor or particle anchor. So I'm going to select that, hit enter, and we'll call it particle anchor. All right, so we've got our particle anchor, and the particle anchor is positioned just at the center of the composition, but we want it to be positioned relative to the ship, so it jumps around with the ship. In order to do that, I'm going to open the rocket's position value and also the particle's position value. And I want to pass these values on to the particle anchor, but I want to do some math specifically to this y value. So normally if we wanted it to just follow along, I would open position here and use this little pick whip guy to point to the position of the rocket. And whenever the rocket jumps around, so too will the anchor. But we don't want it to just jump around from the center, because if we have our particles emitting with this kind of jet of fire and gas kind of coming out of the center of the rocket, that's going to look a little bit weird. So we don't want to do that. Instead, we're going to create an expression here so that we can keep the x value the same, but change the y value dynamically with our slider up here. So I'm going to hold Alt, click on the position stopwatch, and here I'm going to kind of do some of the same things that I did before. I don't have this saved because it's super short, but I'm going to establish a couple of variables. We're going to do x equals, and we're going to tell it to pass this x value in from here. So it's basically going to look for this x value. Now notice I'm not going to position, but I'm going to the actual number, this first number. So now it's going to jump around with x. And the way this is expressed is it says this comp. So in the current composition, look for a layer called rocket. And on that layer, look for the transform property position. And of the two numbers that make up the position, x and y, pass in the first one, which is here in most scripting languages, it always starts with 0, and then you get 1 is actually 2, and 2 is actually 3, and so on and so forth. So here I'm going to put a semicolon to end it. Always end your variables with a semicolon. Now I'm going to do y equals, and do the same thing. Really, we could actually just copy and paste this here, and then change this to a 1. It's going to do the same thing as pick whipping it. So now it's going to reference this second number right here, the 375.1, and then change dynamically as that changes throughout the animation. However, we're also going to add something to this. So I'm going to hit the plus sign. And now I'm going to use this pick whip and point it to the slider that we've got up here. So this is going to let us basically pull this value, whatever the value happens to be at that current time, and then add a certain amount to it, which is going to be controlled by the slider. Currently it's 0. And then finally we need to just apply this whole thing. So down at the bottom in square brackets, we're going to do x for the first value and y for the second value. So I'm basically applying these two variables as our position data in here in these two numbers. And so let's go ahead and click out of that. And now we'll see that as it jumps around, the slider still jumps around with it, and it's still right at the center. But if we go up here and drag the slider number down, increase that number, it's going to move that further down. Now we can move it in the negative and then move it further up, but we actually want it just a little bit down and behind the jet engine for that engine of the rocket. And so now we've got something attached to the rocket that will jump around with the rocket. We're not going to see it as it plays back, but now we can attach our particles emitter to that. So I'm going to go ahead and close this. Let's actually just collapse all these things here. Let's hit P to hide that stuff. All right, so now it's jumping around. And we've got our rig kind of set up and ready to go for our particles. So to create particles, we need to apply the particle effect to pixels. We can't just apply it to nothing. We need to have something there to put it on. So I don't want to put it on any of this stuff because I want to be able to see that. So I'm going to go to Layer, New, Solid, and the solid basically just fills up the screen with a color. The color here doesn't matter because once we put the particle effect on there, it's just going to be whatever color the particles are. So we'll go ahead and name this particle. Particle solid, hit enter, and over here in my effects and presets, I'm going to type in particle, and we're going to use this particle systems 2. There's a few different options. Particle systems 2 is just basic 2D. It's fine for what we want. Particle world has like a floor and some three-dimensionality to it and like friction and stuff. We don't need all that. So we're just going to use particle systems 2. For this, we're going to add it to the particle solid. In the particle solid, we're actually going to want to have under the rocket. And if I play this, we can see what the particles are going to do. Basically, they're just kind of jumping out. It's like sending all these sparks out. And right now, they're not attached to our anchor quite yet. So let's go ahead and attach our producer to the anchor. So in the producer dropdown, this is the thing that kind of emits the particles. We've got a position. We've also got a size for this thing, which we don't care too much about the size, but we do care about the position. So for the position, I'm going to hold the Option key or Alt key, click on this stopwatch, and it's going to open up that script just like we did before. But here, all I'm doing is just scripting this to point to the particle anchor's position. So I'm going to open P, or hit P so it opens position. And now, I don't need to do anything fancy with this or even type anything. I can just click on position here, and we've got this little pick whip guy. If I point that to position of this, it should jump around with our ship, which is exactly what we want to happen. Essentially what it's doing is now the rocket is jumping around randomly. Every time it jumps, it's also passing its position value onto this little anchor, this little null object, which is doing some math, moving it down, and then this particle emitter, or producer, is getting that value passed to it. So I'm just passing values from one thing to the next. And that way, if I want to change the rate that the ship jumps around, or I want to change how far it jumps, I don't need to do anything else. I can very easily tweak that later on without having to worry about this cascading issue of keyframes and stuff that then also all need to be changed in response to that. So let's go ahead and collapse the particles here. We don't need to fill up our work area with all that stuff because we can actually see the effect controls up here at the top in this effect controls panel. There are a couple of things though that we want to change. The spark's not looking so great, so we're going to change the particle, and we're also going to change the physics. First thing, let's go ahead and look at the particle. Instead of a line, I'm going to use a convex lens. And instead of letting these fade out, I'm going to make a maximum opacity of 100%. And instead of having them fade out, I'm just going to have it be constant because we want these to just be kind of constant. For the style I want these to be kind of a flat thing, and then I'm going to add a gradient to it. All right, so that's done. Now we just need to change the physics of this. Now under physics, we've got a few different options. For a particle kind of program, or how it's going to emit the particles, there are a bunch of different things here, like fractal explosive and twirl and all these other things, direction. What I'm going to use is just explosive. I'm going to change some of the other properties around that. First, I'm going to decrease the velocity quite a bit so it's not shooting straight out so much, and it's just going to be shooting down. And that's like 90% done right there. It's just changing the velocity. We could also increase the gravity so it goes down. If we wanted it to go down faster, we could increase the gravity so it's going to kind of pull those faster. But I was actually pretty happy with it just being at just like this. I do want it to move actually a little bit slower instead. So if I wanted it to move slower, rather than changing the gravity, which would kind of force it to go out to the sides a little bit more, I could increase the resistance, which will make them kind of come out a little bit slower. It's actually probably too slow. Let's go ahead and play this again after it renders. It's looking a little bit liquidy, so let's take the resistance down a little bit. Let's take it down to like in the teens somewhere and see what that looks like. Now you do need to let it play. Notice now it's starting to get a little bit slow. Let it play until this line is green, and then you can play it again, and you can see it more accurate. It should play at real time. That's part of the reason that I can't use my video card, is that it would never actually play at real time. It would just kind of keep telling me that it wasn't working. All right, so that's looking pretty good. Let's go ahead and take this down to like, I don't know, like 5 or something, so it's not quite so strong. That's looking pretty good right there. Next, we need to make sure that the particles aren't kind of shooting off the screen. We only want to see the particles just within the background, so I'm going to do another track matte. So I'm going to duplicate the background, put it on top of the particles, name it particle matte. And let's go ahead and set the particle matte, set this to alpha matte. So now we only see that right there. I also want to add a gradient to this. Everything else has got gradients on it, so I want to go ahead and add a gradient to this as well. So for that, let's go back to the beginning here. For the gradient, I'm going to get that from effects and presets. Rather than being part of like the fills of things, gradients are just an effect. So I'm going to go type in gradient, and we're going to add this gradient ramp to the particles. You can kind of see what it's doing here. It's got this like black and white gradient with black at the top, white at the bottom. We're going to first change the positions of these so that the first color is going to be there. Actually, that's going to be a little bit too high. Let's bring it up there. So it's not going to, like if the rocket decides to jump around there, we're not kind of losing it. All right, and then we're going to put our other gradient just slightly off. So now we've got the fade kind of between those 2 points. First color we'll set as some kind of like a yellowy orange thing, real bright. Super bright. It needs to be as bright as possible, but also a little bit kind of faded out, a little bit tinted. And the second color is going to be more of a red. And it's going to be a little bit darker. Just kind of dragging these around until I'm happy with it. It seems a little bit too intense like that. So let's darken it maybe a little bit more intense, but I'm really indecisive when it comes to colors, so you're going to have to just watch me like poke this around a little bit. All right, let's go back to this first one and make this just a little bit more intense too, so it's not quite so light. So there's a nice gradient for us, and so we've got this little guy jumping around, particles coming out of the back of the ship. Actually, I think we want this to be slightly lower, so the nice thing about this, I can go to my particle anchor and just slide this down slightly so it's kind of below the emitter, which is, or kind of below the rocket a little bit. Actually, that's maybe a little bit too far. So now we're getting into like tweaking little details and stuff, which I'm going to put it right there. There we go. Okay. So it's jumping around, it's rotating. We've pretty much got our core animation done. Now we want to kind of introduce this thing, and then we want it to outro. So we want to start with a blank screen. We want to end with a blank screen, have this jump around in the middle a little bit. In the original one, they basically all just scale up from the center, and that's exactly what I'm going to do here. In order for that to happen, though, we're going to need to group these, and the way we group things in After Effects is by pre-composing them. So all the rocket stuff is going to get pre-composed, all of the background stuff, like the lines, those are going to get pre-composed, and the stripes or the border is going to get pre-composed. Actually, before we do that, let's thinking we should add a little drop shadow to this to give it a little bit more depth. So just like lots of other things in After Effects, you type it into your effects panel and you find the effect that you want. So I'm going to put a drop shadow on the rocket. And the light kind of looks like it's coming from the right side, so I'm going to drag this, the shadows more kind of towards the left. I'm going to increase the softness so it just looks a little bit fuzzy there. And the distance as well. We can also change the opacity and make it a little bit lighter too, so it's not quite so strong. Alright, and so I've got this drop shadow. And the nice thing about effects here is that we can just copy this drop shadow and we can put it on the particles. Now that we've set up our drop shadows, I don't really want to set up a drop shadow on this border because it's going to cause some kind of strange problems. The drop shadow will rotate with the border, and while we could fix that with the script, it's also going to kind of like cast a drop shadow outside, which I don't really want the border to cast a drop shadow outside on the background. So instead, what we're going to do, and since we need to pre-compose this stuff anyway, I'm going to go ahead and start pre-composing things, and I'll apply a vignette to the background layer. So I'm going to start kind of organizing these things. One handy thing that you can do in After Effects, just to visualize how you're going to group things and what things are kind of grouped together, is to use colors. Right now, the colors are assigned based on like what kind of layer it is. But if we select all of them and say, all right, well, all these are going to be blue, for instance, that helps me kind of visually say, all right, all of these are stuck together. Same thing with the border is just kind of by itself, but then we've got the particle mat, the rocket, and the particle anchor. Those are all together. Those are really all part of one big system. So we can take those and set them to a let's say like fuchsia. Those are all part of the same thing. So we've got border. Let's make this a little bit brighter, like a yellow or something. So now we can kind of visualize how these need to be grouped up. That's one way to use colors. People use colors in different ways. It just kind of depends on what you find the most handy. But before I start pre-composing things, I kind of like to know, what's going to be attached so I don't forget stuff. So we need to get the back stripes loop and also the stripes mat. And we're going to pre-compose all of those together into one composition. Then we can use that composition as a group to add things like the vignette effect that's going to kind of imitate a drop shadow, and then we can also use it for our scaling purposes. So I'm going to pre-compose these, right-click, pre-compose. I don't need to open this. We'll just call this stripes, or background stripes. Something like that. And again, being consistent with capitals, background stripes. Okay, so there's one, and now it's created this kind of like sand color. The border, because it does have rotation going on, and I don't want to kind of interfere with any of the properties going on this, I'm going to go ahead and pre-compose this as well, and it's just going to set, it's also going to set the center for this to the center of the document. Sometimes our properties have our objects have their own animation and their own center. We want it to be centered around the center of the document. A quick way to do that is to just pre-compose it. So I'm going to right-click and pre-compose this as well. We'll just call this border comp. And I want to move all attributes to the new composition, so I want to move the rotation and all that stuff into the new composition. I think I did this with this one as well. Position. Yeah, this one is as it's supposed to be. And then same thing with our rocket. All this stuff is going to go into one composition, so I'm going to take all these, right-click, pre-compose, and we'll call this the rocket comp. And again, move everything into the new composition. I don't care about opening it. I just want to move it into a new composition. So we've got three things, all of them now with the same center, same size. They're all the same size as the composition. And of course, we could make these smaller if we wanted to, but it doesn't really matter at this point. Let's go ahead and add our vignette to this. So to add a vignette, I'm going to go into Effects and Presets. VIG, there's CC vignette. I'm going to drag that onto the background with stripes. We're going to increase the angle of, actually let's increase our number here first. So we get it a little bit stronger. And then we're going to increase this angle of view number. Now, it's kind of finding a balance here. I don't want it super, super strong, and I don't want it kind of sticking way out into the background. That looks fine. So we'll leave that as is. And now we want these to all kind of scale up from nothing. Now there are some pretty cliche things that you can do to get stuff on and off the screen. And one of them, of course, is scaling. You can wipe, you can scale, you can move stuff off to the left and the right. And you want to avoid, cliches if you can, but you can also just do cliches in kind of a new, fresh, poppy way, and then they don't feel so cliche. So one thing that I'm going to do is for all of these, I'm going to scale them up. Now these are all going to have the same size, so we have the same scale for everything, but that's going to be slightly different. Like they're going to disappear at different rates because of the size of the art that's actually on here. But I'm going to go ahead and do them all in one go and hit S, and then we're going to keyframe these. So we're at 100%, and I'm just going to say, like, we're going to make this super slow at first. So at 1 second, that's going to be our first keyframe. So I'm going to go ahead and, that's going to be our final position, so they look like they are right now. So I'm going to go ahead and click the stopwatch. With all of them selected, it records the keyframes for all of those. We'll come back to the beginning, and we'll just scale these down to like nothing. We'll set it to 0, so we don't even see them on the screen at all. And so over that first little bit of time, they will scale up, and then we'll see the rocket jumping around and stuff. Now, to make this less cliche, so this is the problem, it's just scaling up. It feels very mechanical, it feels very stiff. And this is something that you definitely want to avoid in your animation. Let's go ahead and set my work area. I'm going to set this to about here by hitting the N key. So the N key brings the end of my work area to wherever the playhead is. This is happening, first of all, it's happening really, really slow. And second of all, it's happening very kind of mechanically. One thing that we can do to mitigate that is to kind of add some exaggeration. It's one of the principles of motion is exaggerating something. And so one thing that I like to do is I'm just going to scale it up to be a little bit too big and then scale it back down. So at about here, we're going to make it, instead of 100%, we'll make it 110. So now it's 110%, and then it scales back down. And this actually, we want this to be on all of these. So I'm just going to select all of them, and we'll type in 110 again. So it's going to get too big, and then kind of bounce back to size. Now, this still is very mechanical, and part of the reason is, or the main reason is because of the interpolation of these. By default, Illustrator assumes that everything is just going to have this very linear interpolation, and that doesn't really look that great, because nothing in nature moves with linear interpolation. There's always some force, overcoming another force, so there's inertia that builds up, and so no car just immediately starts at 60 miles an hour. It has to go from 0 to 60, and it takes some time to get there. And same thing happens here. Nothing just starts moving at 60 miles an hour. We need to kind of gradually increase that. So one way to do that, I'm going to make this happen a little bit faster so it feels a little bit more punchy. But one way to do that is to change our interpolation. We can right-click these keyframes, and I've got all of these selected. I'm going to go to Keyframe Assistant and just do Easy Ease. So this is the really cheap way to get it to look a little bit more natural. This is still happening really slow. And it's all right, but we're not quite there. Easy Ease is partially solved our problem. Let's zoom in on this a little bit more so we can kind of see this a little bit better. I think I've zoomed in a little bit too far. There we go. All right, I'm going to just kind of tweak the timing of this until it feels a little bit more punchy and poppy. So this kind of scaling up thing is very nice. Now it feels a little bit more kind of quick, and it feels like it's got some inertia. But we also want it to kind of settle down into position. Let's go ahead and extend this out so it's not happening so fast. It's like flashing animation here. All right. So now it's kind of doing what we want, but we want a little bit better control over how this speeds up and slows down. So in order to do that, I'm going to select all these keyframes. And this little button right here is going to open what's called the graph editor. And the graph editor lets us change how things kind of speed up and slow down over time. Right now our graph editor is pretty much just kind of showing these basic arcs that were created by the Easy Ease, but we're going to tweak that a little bit. One thing that I find a little bit frustrating with this is that it usually starts off with a value graph, which isn't necessarily the most handy thing to use. It can be a little bit frustrating. So I'm going to change this to the speed graph. So value graph is going to look like this. Speed graph is going to look like this. So with the value graph, we're essentially seeing how the scale changes over time. And speed graph, we're going to see how quickly, what the highest speed is. With this, we would want our highest speed to be, down here. The problem with this is that we also need to select both of these. For this one, I'm going to use the value graph just because it makes a little bit more sense. I'm going to select, let's get all of these guys again. Scale, there we go. So we got a scale for all of these. And I'm just going to drag a box around all those keyframes. And I can kind of keep this scale a little bit lower, let it kind of gradually increase over time. This one here, I'm going to bring this in a little bit so it kind of has this little jump, this little pop up at the top, and then I'm going to zoom in on this, select all these, and remember you got to drag a box around these because otherwise you're just going to edit one at a time, which isn't helpful. So we've got to drag a box around it, and these here, we're going to bring these out just a little bit. And then we can see what this looks like. I'm going to hit spacebar, and now we've got this nice kind of poppy little animation where it just jumps out at us, and it's got this little extra exaggeration where it seems like it's kind of jumped out too far, the inertia's kind of taken it too far, and then it kind of settles back into place. And it settles back into place nice and soft because it gradually slows down there. So that's exactly what we want. We're going to click out of the graph editor, so we're back here in our our regular timeline, and we can see our keyframes. Another thing that's going to help spice this up a little bit is to scale these at different times. So instead of just having them all scale up at once, we can scale one and then another and another. So I might scale, for instance, the border and then also the background together, but then have the rocket scale up separately. So let's drag this out a little bit. Now the timing of this is not ideal because it's jumping like right as it gets there, so we could have this scale up at a little bit different time. And we're also, because of the scale, see we're seeing the particles here, so what we're going to do is actually just move this a little bit further so it does a jump or something, and then we see it coming into place. I'm also going to turn off the particles until it's in position. So right there at that time, that's when it's in position. I want the particles to be stopped until that moment. So I'm going to go into that composition. If I go to project, I can see my rocket comp here. There's the rocket comp. Let's double click on that to open it. And we're going to go to our particle effect here, the particles themselves, and then go to our effect controls. And we don't need gradient. We don't need the drop shadow here, but we do want to see our birth rate. So with birth rate, I'm going to go ahead and keyframe birth rate for this. So let's go ahead and click that, and now down here, just to see those keyframes, I'm going to hit U on the keyboard, and so now we can see where those keyframes are. So at the very beginning, I want there to be no birth rate, and then I want it to suddenly start playing right here. It's not what we're going to get. It's going to gradually increase the birth rate over those first few seconds. So not quite what we want. What we need to do is change the interpolation of those keyframes. So right now, it's basically these keyframes is a linear interpolation, so it's starting at 0 and gradually increasing until it gets to here. I want it to just suddenly jump right here. So what I'm going to do is take these keyframes, and then I'm going to set them by right-clicking. I'm going to go to keyframe interpolation and change this from linear to hold. So it's just going to hold that until another keyframe comes in that tells it to do something else. So it's going to not play, and then all of a sudden it's going to start emitting particles. So that's not going to happen until, since we know that that's the time that it gets into place, that's when it's going to start emitting particles. So let's go back to our rocket composition and see how this looks. We can extend this out a little bit too, the spacebar. This is feeling still a little bit fast, and it's also a little bit weird with the timing of that jump. It's kind of like jumping as it scales up, which is a little bit weird. So what we can do is we can take all of these keyframes. We can just scale these down. Now, to scale down your time, hold the Alt key and click and drag these, and you can see that it'll basically just decrease these timing proportionally. So now it happens to get into place before it jumps. This is going to look a little bit punchier, and then it's going to start jumping around. All right, that's pretty good. So now what we need to do is we need to get these to scale down at the end. So I'm going to play this out for a little bit and see just how long do I want to watch this thing jumping around, and then we'll scale it down off the screen. So scale it up. Jump, jump, jump. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 2, 3, 4, 5. So we'll let it go about 6 jumps. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then on 6 it'll scale down. So let's play that out. I'll try to be fast. There. So right there, oh, it looped again. Okay. So 1. Okay. So right there, that was 5. That jump. That's how slow I was in pressing the spacebar. So after that, that's where we're going to scale all these things down again. Now, how is this going to work? Well, there's our, where was our last jump? There it is, right there. That jump right there. So how is this going to work? Well, basically I'm just going to take these keyframes that I've already set up, copy them, paste them down here, not the layers, just the keyframes. Just the keyframes, dummy. We just want the keyframes, and then, so we're going to take the keyframes. I guess we're going to have to do this one at a time. I was thinking we can do this manually, or all at once, but I guess not. Control-C, Control-V, Control-C, Control-V. And now we're going to take these keyframes, and we're going to right-click, and then we're going to go to Keyframe Assistant, and we're going to time reverse keyframes. We'll basically just play the same thing in reverse. I also want to set these last keyframes here, 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 and here to hold, so that they're going to hold between them, because otherwise it's just going to be doing this like bouncy scale thing, which is kind of weird. We don't want that to happen throughout our animation. Actually, no, we don't need to do that. Okay. So now it just holds that value, and then at the end, they all scale down at the same time. I want the rocket to scale down first, so I'm just going to move these keyframes a little bit later, just like I had them earlier before. I want them to, oops, a little bit later, I said. There we go. So now by moving those keyframes a little bit later, now the rocket will scale down, and then the rest. Now this is, you'll notice this is causing a problem here with the scale of these. So we want to set these to hold. I'm going to select these two, right click, and we're going to set hold. So keyframe interpolation. We're going to go to hold, click OK. Same thing with these here. Actually, I think we can just go ahead and do all of these at once. So right click and set keyframe interpolation to hold. So now they just stay at that size, and then they scale down the way they're supposed to. Now I have the same problem here where, see, the particles are kind of revealing that mask, and we don't want that to happen. So as soon as we get to about, we want the particles to basically turn off very, very quickly. So right here, before it starts scaling down, we want the particles to basically turn off by this point right here. So I'm going to go back into my rocket composition, and I can essentially just kind of do exactly what I did before, but in reverse, or just even copy and paste these keyframes. Control-C, Control-V, except this time I'm going to right-click and Keyframe Assistant, time reverse, so that it happens backwards. It's messed up the holding here, and I want the 0 to be right at the slider, so I want them to turn off by then, and I want this to happen. Actually, we'll go ahead and just set these to hold. There's no reason to have them turned on again, so this is just going to be on, and then we're just going to hold those. We're going to set all of these to keyframe interpolation, hold, which is what they're doing right now. So it should, we need one more keyframe. Oh, this one is going to be 0, so it should, it's actually probably going to need to come a little bit earlier than that, because and that kind of falls out. It takes a little bit of time for those to kind of fall off the screen. Let's go back into Rocket and see if that's looking correct. Nope, it is not. So we need them completely off the screen by this point right here. So let's go ahead and go back into Rocket Comp. I'm just going to move this keyframe, not all of them, just this one, just back a little bit until those particles have completely kind of fallen off the screen. So it'll terminate a little bit before the rocket starts to scale down, and now everything can wipe off the screen. Okay, pretty short animation. This is 4 seconds so far. Now, what else can we do to kind of make this a little bit more interesting? The scaling is okay, but it's not really that great. We're still doing this on kind of a black background. So one other thing that we can do to make this a bit more interesting is to add a color to the background. And we can also use masks to kind of reveal that background in an interesting way. So just so that we can kind of see the size, of things. I'm going to hide the rocket composition for now because we don't want to see that quite yet. I'm going to go to layer, create a new solid, and we'll call this background. And it's probably going to give this a gradient of some sort, but for now we'll say it's blue, it's fine, and it's going to be the same size as our document, which is fine. We're going to put this behind everything else, so it starts earlier than everything else. But I also need to give it a mask. One thing that's tricky with masks is that they don't have their own position. They're just positioned based on the thing that they're attached to, but I want to leave this position in the center. I don't want to move this whole layer around. I just want to move the mask around. And there's really, in order to do this and kind of make it stay symmetrical, we just kind of have to eyeball it, really. And that's all you can really do. I'm just going to zoom in on this. Let's bring this down a little bit. So in After Effects, whenever you start drawing with these, either the pen tool or the primitive shapes tool, it depends on what you have selected. What it's going to create depends entirely on what you have selected. And currently I have this solid color selected. So that means that if it's a raster thing, like a solid or some footage or Illustrator object, what it's going to default to draw is not going to be a vector shape, but it's going to be a vector mask. If you had a shape layer selected when you started drawing, or if you had nothing selected, it would create a shape layer for you and start drawing a shape. And we'll get into shape layers here in just a bit, but for now, what I want to do is just kind of add a mask. And unfortunately for mask, we really just have to eyeball it. I can drag this out. You can kind of see what this mask is doing. I can hold spacebar and reposition it just like in Illustrator. I can hold Shift and make sure that it stays nice and circular. Holding Alt doesn't do anything for us. So if I hold Alt, it does not keep it scaling towards the center, and that's another difficulty that we have with them. I'm just going to kind of place it and try to make it the same size and same position as the background and make it as close as possible just by eyeballing it. It's jumping around a little bit here. It's not ideal, but we'll try to get it as close as possible. Okay, so there's our mask. And our mask, it's only going to play a role for a second or so. Basically what the mask is going to do, though, is it's going to reveal this blue layer. It's going to start from nothing and it's going to kind of reveal the entire thing. We don't need to change the size of the mask, but what we do need to change is the mask expansion. So in order to see this a little bit better, let's go ahead and expand out mask. And we've got mask, path, feather, opacity, and expansion. Right now it's at 0, so this is just the path by itself. Let's go ahead and fit this to the screen so we can see the size of this. If I increase the expansion, it's going to fill up the screen. If I decrease it, it's going to go down to nothing. So we want to start this where we can't even see it, where it's just not even recognizable. Just past that is where we're going to start that. That's going to be our first keyframe. So I'm going to click the stopwatch to start recording keyframes, and that's at -241 pixels. And then after a little bit, basically the same amount of time that it takes for these things to scale up, we want this thing to scale up and fill the entire screen. So we're going to have it fill, and just kind of fill the entire screen, just like that. And we also want to go and we're going to ease this real quick, just to, because we know that we want to see it a little bit smoother than what it's going to be by default. So, and we also want to move everything else up here. We're going to move that so it happens just a little bit later. So I'm going to take all this stuff, just move this, all of this stuff. Let me deselect my solid here. We want that to happen kind of after, or start happening after this one has started. Now notice with these, I'm never kind of having one thing happen and then another thing happen. I always start something and then I have another thing start while that's still in the process of transforming. It's layering your motion. Will always make it just look a little bit more dynamic. If you have one thing happen at a time, it's kind of like listening to a little kid tell a story where everything is and then we went to the park, and then I went to school, and then I found a book, and then it just it's very broken up and disjointed and kind of hard to follow. So I like to layer these things. Now I am going to ease this a little bit. Let's go ahead and play it and see what it looks like. And so I'm going to hit N. Let's bring this back a little bit. Let's play it so it just loops. And the speed is good. I think it could have a little bit better acceleration. So I'm going to select these and go into our timeline editor or graph editor. And this currently is in the value graph, that's fine. I'm going to go into speed graph though. And speed graph shows us that it kind of goes very fast in the middle and then kind of slows down gradually. One thing I can do, I'm going to fit all graphs here so we can see this a little bit better. I'm going to select this one, just drag this in. Select this one and just kind of drag this in. So it's going to kind of gradually accelerate and then decelerate towards the outside. It's going to have this little peak of motion. That's just going to change the way it plays a little bit. And we can actually, I think it's looking a little bit flashy right now. It's kind of like this big bright blue flash. Let's slow that down a little bit. So we can extend this thing out and have it still, like it completes when these complete. And I think that might. Perfect. Okay, so now we've got this kind of like opening, and we're going to have the rocket jumping around for a little bit. Turn the rocket back on. All right, so now, same thing to get rid of it. I'm just going to grab all these guys, Control C, and here towards the end, let's zoom out a little bit and come down here at the end. I'm just going to put this where we want it to start, which is going to be like here, kind of after everything else has started already, is almost wrapped up. I'm going to hit Control V. We're going to reverse these. So we're right-click, enable keyframe assistant, enable time reverse, and then for these two, so I don't have to keyframe a bunch in the middle, I'm just going to right-click and go to keyframe interpolation and set this to hold. So it just kind of holds them from one position to the next. Now it's not holding in the direction that I wanted it to, but let's see. Yeah, so now it's just not quite what we wanted. So let's see what this does. If it's going to do weird stuff. Oh, that's fine, I think. Okay, so we don't need to set these to hold on the kind of in the middle. And let's look at the timing in the last little bit there. So as these are about here, we can go ahead and have it start to scale down. So we can go ahead and have it here. So where these are almost about to disappear, let's go ahead and have this kind of on the screen as if it's about to happen as well. And then it just kind of follows them off. All right. Last little thing too, I'd like to put some kind of like decoration around this. So as this thing is jumping around, we'll have like a little, some lines or something. Let's also give this a gradient. I feel like this kind of needs a gradient. So I'm going to go to gradient, gradient ramp. We'll add that to our background. And instead of a linear ramp, let's set this to radial. And we'll take our black color and kind of put it in the center, and we'll take this one and kind of put it out like here somewhere. So we have this nice kind of fade out towards the sides. And here in the center, we'll give this kind of a darker bluish color on the outside. Just click OK. On the outside, we'll give it more of like a blue-green kind of color, or I guess we can do more of a green. Let's do more of a blue-green, and let's keep it also a little bit darker too, so it's not kind of, it's not so much. There we go. So that's fine. So it gives us a little bit of a gradient there, and then it wipes off the screen. Okay, now we also want to have our kind of decoration. So I'm going to collapse all this stuff. We're done with those, done with those, done with those, and those. What I want is to have a shape layer that kind of draws some little lines around this. So when it scales up, when it gets to like here, it's going to have these little lines that kind of go around. And to get that to happen, I'm going to right-click, create a new shape layer. And then on the shape layer, We can expand that out and we can add some content. So every shape layer has a contents section, and I'm going to click add, and we're going to add an ellipse. This is a really quick way to make sure that you've got a circle that's right in the center, by the way. If you want to make a circle and make it centered, this is the way to do it. So ellipse path, here we've got a size thing, so I'm just going to kind of scale that up until it's a little bit bigger than the background. Let's make sure that this thing is completely at size. It is. Let's go ahead and make this size just a tiny bit bigger. Looks pretty good. All right, so next we're going to give this a color. So we need to give it a gradient stroke, or just a regular stroke. I'm going to go ahead and put a gradient stroke because that's what I did before. So gradient stroke. I'm going to edit the gradient. So for the colors, we'll go ahead and put, let's see, for this one, I'm going to select this one, and we'll, I think before what I did was like one was like warm and the other one was cool or something. I think I did like a pink and a blue, and the other one was like blue and yellow. So we'll go ahead and start with like our pink color. It is really nice and bright, so it kind of shines in there, and then the next color will make it more of like a bluish purple kind of color. So we've got like a warm and a cool on each one, kind of like that. So we'll click OK. I'm going to increase the stroke a little bit, so our stroke control is up here. We also have a stroke width down here. Just because our our layer system has to be so big here that it's kind of hard to see what it's actually going to look like. So let's bring that down. I'm just going to scroll down through these until we can actually see what we're doing. I hate this about After Effects. It's just really, really tough to actually see what we're doing. So another thing that I want to add is a trim path. So I'm going to add trim path. So trim path, and what trim path does is allow us to draw the stroke on, and you can actually use that with all sorts of things. Let's go ahead and collapse our gradient stroke, but trim path I'm going to expand out. Let's just bring this up a little bit so it's above my keyboard shortcut thing. All right, so trim paths, we have a start and an end, and I'm going to zoom in on this just a little bit so we can see what this is going to do. The start, we can animate around, so it basically just kind of draws that on, and I want to have this thing draw on and then draw off. And actually, we'll start with the end, and then we'll do the start. So I'm going to go ahead and keyframe the end. Actually, we can keyframe the start as well. So we'll do that. Come down here just a little bit. And the end, I'm going to drag to 0. The start, I'm going to drag to 100. And I'm going to offset this a little bit. So it kind of like, actually, let's go ahead and edit these in the keyframe assistant and do easy ease. I'm not super concerned about acceleration with these. We just want them to look a little bit smoother. Let's go ahead and set the ending point. Not quite what we wanted. So what we want is for it to start with nothing. So the end is going to be start at 0 and then draw to 100. And if you don't want to have to do that, you can always just double click on these and change the value. Right now it's at 0, so we'll drag it up to 100. So what it'll do is kind of draw on and then also draw off in one go. So we get this little hint of a line as it kind of draws around the outside. So we get that, which is nice. Okay. And what I'm going to do is just duplicate this whole thing. So I'm going to hit Control D, and we've already got all of our stuff set up, but I'm going to go into Contents here. We're going to make the ellipse a little bit bigger. So ellipse path, I'll go in here and make the size just a tiny bit bigger. Let's go ahead and see what it looks like in relationship to the other. That looks pretty good. I'm going to go into the colors. So my gradient stroke, we'll expand that out, and I want to change the gradient color. So for this first one, instead of doing a warm color, I'll do the cool color here, which the cool color will be kind of a bluish. Something I can even probably do like a similar kind of a darker blue, and then the next color over here is going to be like this yellowy green. There we go. Okay, so now they're going to draw on, they're drawing on the same way, and so the next thing I want to do is just reverse these keyframes. So I'm going to hit U on the keyboard to collapse all this stuff so I can see just the keyframes themselves. And I'm going to grab all these, right-click, keyframe assistant, and time reverse. And so now one is going to go one direction and the other is going to draw the other direction. So let's hit B there and we can see what this is doing. So we just get this little hint. This is one of those little details that adds a lot to it. It doesn't take very long to implement, but just adds something extra to the animation. It's also one of the details you want to wait until the end to do it. You don't want to be doing this like, you know, at the beginning, because then you might change something or change the scale, and then you've got to fix all this stuff. So let's zoom out here. Let's have a look, and go ahead and start at the very beginning. Scales up, jumps around, and then everything scales down. Perfect. Okay, so that's what we want. As soon as it's off the screen, where does it exit? It's about 5, just a little more than 4 seconds. I'm going to hit N on the keyboard so we get the end of the work area. And then the very last thing that we're going to do is rotate this. It's really tempting to start with the rotation, and if you start with the rotation, it makes everything so much harder. But all we're going to do is just rotate this rocket composition. So I'm going to take the rocket composition, I'm going to hit R, and I'm going to rotate it like that. And that is what it looks like in the original image. It's kind of going up at this little angle. Now if we play it, it does what we want, and then scales. Perfect. All right, that is it. That is our animation. Now we need to export it. So before we export, we're going to go to trim this composition. So this is our entire animation here, just over 4 seconds. Let's make sure it ends on an empty screen. I'm going to deselect everything so we don't have anything selected. Make sure that it ends, that it is kind of completely off. There we go. And then set our end there. I can go up to composition, trim comp to work area, and then we're just going to export this comp. So I'm going to go to composition, and I'm going to go to add to media encoder queue. Now you can add to render queue, and what that'll give you is this like nice high quality uncompressed video, which is great for, you know, if you're going to bring it into Premiere or something like that and you want to have like a really nice quality video. What we want though is something that's like web ready and a much smaller file. So I'm going to go to add to media encoder queue. All right. Right now it already has the preset that I want to use. Essentially you can click this drop down and get a whole bunch of different presets. There's high quality presets, there's different kind of website presets. What I'm going to use is the YouTube 1080p Full HD. Click on that. That's going to set a couple of other things. So we've got our H.264, that's the codec that it's going to use. And then we've also got to set where this is going to go. So I'm going to click this, and I'm just going to put this on the desktop. Rocket.mp4, perfect. And then once you're ready, you've got it saved, or got it set to a location. You just click play, and it will think about this, and eventually, once it's done calculating, it will export a video that looks like this. And that's essentially what we're going to end up with once it's done exporting. If it actually plays correctly. There we go. Okay, so that has been two-part video. First Illustrator, now After Effects. We can go ahead and see what this one looks like. It finished a little bit faster than I thought it would, so let's collapse all this other stuff. Actually, just click this to get to the desktop. Open our MP4 video here. And there we go. That is the end of our video. Now, if Windows would play this without being quite so laggy, it would be nice, but can't control that. So, that's been After Effects, Illustrator, and in the next video we're going to do some web stuff and just kind of continue the whole tour de force of digital art here. And I'll see you in that next video.